It is a lot of resources that could go to the development of the region. But influence isn't exercised just through illegal monetary transactions. Opaque campaign financing, trafficking in influence, control of information, and at times extortion are all tools of the abuse of power for private gain. As a result, public policies are seriously distorted and resources misallocated. Looking at the brighter side, because there is a much brighter side as well amidst us. Many countries have now established formal democratic systems. Reasonably free elections have produced a new generation of leaders, many of them elected on anti-corruption platforms. This is a major achievement after decades of difficult times with some military dictatorships and at times rigged elections. And after years of recession, greater fiscal discipline and lower inflation rates are producing economic growth, and exports are thriving in our part of the world. Yet, there is a growing concern about the quality and the durability of these new democracies. We have seen in other parts of the world how easy it is to move backward once we have reached a certain stage. My hope is that this will not happen, because it is so important that progress continue. Because the institutions that underlie a fully functional democracy have yet to measure up in certain countries of this region to standards that one would like to see achieved. Last year's Global Corruption Barometer report of Transparency International indicated widespread dissatisfaction by the people of our region with political parties and public institutions. And the 15 countries of Latin America included in the barometer ranked political parties and parliaments as those most affected by corruption, with the police and the judiciary following close behind. We also find similar results in North America. In the US, for example, Congress has been tarnished by special interest in politics, as we have seen in bribery and lobbying cases concerning Randy Cunningham, James Traficant, and Jack Abramoff. I always like to say that no country has a total monopoly on transparency and on integrity. In a disturbing sign of continuing pessimism, half the barometer respondents in 5 countries, that is Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, expressed the belief that corruption will worsen. Nicaraguans were the most pessimistic, with more than 6 out of 10 believing that the situation will get much worse. On this basis, one can reasonably assume that the region's citizens do not yet perceive positive changes as a result of their new leadership's anti-corruption pledges. And we continue to hope at Transparency International that there's just a lag and that the next year will show better results. That still has to come. So the twin challenges of democracy and economic development persist in concert is no coincidence. Democracy is not a luxury or an issue of ideology. It's a fundamental precondition for social and economic development. This is clearly acknowledged in the Inter-American Charter on Democracy. It says, democracy and social and economic development are interdependent, and are mutually reinforcing, and that democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas. And that's why only effective, independent, and accountable institutions and the rule of law can ensure that public policies are pursued in the public interest, not for private or political gain. I can tell you that fighting corruption is not easy. And we need to stress the role of bribe payers in this, and of the professional facilitators who give a facade of legitimacy to corrupt acts. And we are also finding, as we look into our experience, that there is a tremendous resilience of embedded networks that are found, but very often, most often, very difficult to find in our midst. But they're there, they're resilient, and even if you have a new government arriving in power with a determination to have a much more accountable, transparent government and to fight corruption, these embedded systems are there, and they change their color, they change their shape, and they come back to the surface. We'd like to see all of us working together and work towards a better future. And there is encouraging progress that we have to keep in mind. The region has seen a lot of that progress in the recent years. Transparency has increased considerably, reflecting the trend around the world to acknowledge its importance. Many stakeholders now recognize the cost of corruption, and they are joining the fight, changing their habits and taking up leadership in their respective fields. This includes private companies, local political leaders, journalists, civil society organizations who help generate, first of all, awareness. Corruption is no longer taboo. We can talk about it, which we could not even 15 years ago. And also, these are the people who push for reform and as well continue to monitor progress and report on it. Some of them also put their lives on the line, standing up to corruption in the face of immense pressures and threats, not only to themselves but to their families. I met last week, as a matter of fact, a week ago today, with Dr. Ana Cecilia Magallanes Cortez, the Peruvian prosecutor, who is the leading force in the prosecution of some 1,500 members of the criminal organization headed by Vladimiro Montesinos in Peru. She was honored with Transparency International's Integrity Award earlier this month in Guatemala for her extraordinary courage in pursuing these cases. For her, she did receive a lot of threats. So did her family, so did her teenage children. But we do want to put these acts of courage up because they do inspire all of us. This year's 10th anniversary of the conclusion of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption is an important milestone. This multilateral framework against corruption and its monitoring mechanism play an important role ensuring that governments translate their commitment into action. We were speaking earlier and recognizing that this was the first convention. It led the way. It also led the way in involving civil society in its development and after that in the monitoring. And the committee has issued valuable reports on country progress, including important recommendations for strengthening national systems to reduce corruption. Implementation of these recommendations will be critical to the success of the convention. And we welcome the committee's attention to ensuring that action takes place. We find at times that people commit, but then there is a great lag between the commitment and the action. So we would like to see greater civil society engagement in developing action plans and more public reporting on progress in this area. We are hopeful that the recent U.S. government contribution of $1 million to the Inter-American Anti-Corruption Fund and a recent commitment of support from Inter-American Development Bank President Luis Alberto Moreno will lead to greater civic engagement and progress in implementing those recommendations. The real long-term challenge clearly lies in effective implementation and enforcement. There's a high risk that the anti-corruption agenda will lose credibility if we cannot demonstrate that it has had an impact. And since this was the first, then we in this region ought to lead the way to the other conventions so that we continue that very special role that was started in the 90s. However, 10 years after conclusion of the convention, MESESIC has completed a review of only 3 articles, and it appears that some country may be waiting to take action until it is time for them to be reviewed. We must not allow the review process to delay the action necessary to achieve the reduction in corruption that the convention promised a number of years ago. And it's for this reason that TI urged the Second Conference of State Parties meeting here in Washington, D.C. last week to accelerate the pace of review and, most important, called on each state's party to report to the 2-7 General Assembly on the steps it has taken since ratification to implement the entirety of the convention. State parties took on obligations when they ratified the convention years ago. It's time for this generation of Latin American leaders to publicly account for progress in fulfilling these obligations. By doing so, they will reassure citizens across the hemisphere that they are moving beyond words and paper and are acting against corruption. This initiative must not lose momentum. Keeping it on track demands stronger commitment at the top, because no fight against corruption can succeed without leadership. It's also important that the anti-corruption effort not be seen as competing with other important initiatives, such as increasing economic development or fighting poverty. In fact, fighting corruption is a prerequisite to reduce poverty and increasing economic development. One of our good friends in Transparency International, John Gitongo from Kenya, always says that corruption manufactures poverty. He has seen it in his country and in many other countries. So full implementation of the anti-corruption agenda implies a radical change of political culture and practices. A primary element must be to institutionalize a culture of accountability based on a full understanding of its pivotal role in an equitable and prosperous society. Transparency and accountability are preconditions to the full empowerment of citizens. Accountability in the public sector means that public authorities systematically provide information, including systematic access to information, transparent public administration, whether in public contracting, political finance, or a multitude of other areas. Notably, the International Monetary Fund's revised Code of Good Practices on Fiscal Transparency provides that the publication of fiscal information should be a legal obligation of governments. In this hemisphere, 5 countries now have laws on access to information, and others are enacting them. Last week in Guatemala, Secretary General José Miguel Sousa spoke at the opening plenary of the International Anti-Corruption Conference and underscored that civil society participation is fundamental to preventing and denouncing corruption. And during a question period, he even suggested that one should have a charter for access to information. The OAS has provided numerous opportunities for civil society to cooperate in efforts to reduce corruption. Many lessons have been learned in this past decade. Most importantly, that we are all in this